Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 19th of November 2024. It's Martin North from Digital Finance and Literacy. Great to have you on this evening. Thank you very much for taking some of your Tuesday evening out to spend it with us. It's really appreciated and nice to see some new names as well as some of the old faithfuls. Just before I bring Robbie in, just remind you, of course, as we do, we don't provide specific financial or legal advice. This is a general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your comments and questions in as we go. If you'd like to ask a question for Robbie or myself, if you use that Walk the World, that's going to get to the top of my queue, so there's much more chance of it getting my attention. I don't necessarily follow all of the things that go on in the chat because there's just so much that goes on. And also enable Tuber Chat, which means if you want to get your question on top of the list, you can do that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always greatly appreciated. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we think there's a really important conversation to be had, and your support really makes a great difference. So thank you. And Robbie, welcome, welcome. Good to see you back.
Thanks, Martin. Good to see you.
And thanks for coming on at relatively short notice. I know you've had a busy few days, one way and another, what with the launch party over the weekend, or the launch program for the party over the weekend, and a few other things too. But look, there's so much to talk about. And I guess what I wanted to do was to start with some of the immediate issues and then perhaps work out in sort of concentric circles and talk about some of the broader policy issues. Because I think we have to also to bear in mind some of the international dynamics that are going on across the country. We'll talk about the role of the media and what they're not and what they should be doing. And also talk about the future shape of the political agenda in Australia, not least because, of course, there's a bill floating around at the moment to change the way that political funding works. And that could be disadvantageous to everybody but the big, some would say the uni party. So lots to talk about.
Oh yeah, for sure. And maybe we should start with the really big one that's been on everyone's mind, and it's coming to a head right now in this last sitting of Parliament this week, which is the mis and disinformation bill. Because we're on the verge of a victory here, but not one that we can take for granted. As of right now, the votes are locked, 38 to 38. And when I say locked, the no votes are locked, 38. The yes votes, I wouldn't say are locked because the Greens actually haven't declared which way they're going to vote. So that's quite important, and hopefully we can still push them to vote the right way. The worry that's been expressed to me, and this is worth reminiscing about. The worry that's been expressed to me, Martin, is that when it's 38-38, although that is a defeat for the bill because it doesn't have the absolute majority that it needs, the people who have helped organise those votes in the Parliament are concerned that someone on the no side may trip over their shoelaces on the way to the chamber and not make it in time before the doors are locked. And they do get locked. So what happens is you have 4 minutes, they ring the bells, and you got 4 minutes to get into the chamber. And anything could happen in those 4 minutes. And the person who expressed this concern to me was actually concerned that it might be one of the Liberals, one or two of the Liberals that find themselves locked in the dunny or something. Because after all, it was the Liberals who initiated this bill. So then they would get the best of both worlds. They under pressure from the public, bailed out because they're, in some respects, I hate to say this, but in some respects, the Liberals in this way are smarter than Labor. They sniffed the political winds pretty quickly and bang, we're out of here, right? So they saw the revolt. 24,000 submissions to the exposure draft. That's all they needed. It's like, all right, that's enough. We defeated the cash ban in 2019 with, I think, 4,600 submissions to the exposure draft. And that was a record then. 24,000, that's all the Liberals needed. Silly Labor, though, they thought that, they'd soldier on. And but why would the Liberals be for it in the first place? Well, this is a global agenda, which we talked about recently with John Adams on your program, right? This is something that the UK has coordinated with Australia and with the EU and with people in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, but sort of like the old type Republicans, the pre-Trump Republicans, right? This is the national security state. This is the global censorship apparatus, which ties into the global military-industrial complex, etc. The people who need to control information so they can control propaganda. And believe me, there are most of the people in the Liberal Party well and truly signed up to that. But they know that you have to manage those agendas with what the public's prepared to tolerate, and so they jumped out as quick as they could when they saw that backlash. So that's the worry. Now, what we're doing, we put out a release today saying that people really need to bear down this week and keep the pressure on the Greens. We need the Greens to come out on the right side on this, because that makes it absolutely certain then. Doesn't matter who trips over their shoelaces, right? It makes it, it removes all doubt. The bill, I'm pretty sure so it's Tuesday night. Tomorrow, the report is due to hand down, and then the bill is scheduled for presentation to the Senate next week.
Yeah.
And they'll vote on it. It's one of 30 bills that are in a logjam in the Senate that Labor wants to pass in this last 2 weeks. All right, it's one of 30. Anyway, just on something the Greens need to be very cognizant of here, and I'm just really flabbergasted I have to say this, and what really surprises me, Martin, and you're the great political philosopher, you know this better than anybody. Like the basic principles around free speech and censorship are lessons that were learned centuries ago. And one of them is, when you go down this path, whatever you do will eventually be used against you. So the thing we highlighted with the Greens in this release today is something quite simple. The Greens have been very outspoken on Gaza, as has the Citizens Party. October 7 happened, and absolutely shocking. The Hamas attack was absolutely shocking. No one denies that. But within weeks, it was starting to become clear that the response to that was so extreme, so over the top, and it's just the mass slaughter of babies and innocent women, etc. And it's unconscionable. And now we can see clearly that the man who's perpetrated that never cared about the hostages. Half his country hates him. He doesn't want to get rid of he doesn't want to bring the hostages back. Anyway, we might talk about that a bit more later, right? But anyway, not to get off track. But one of the things that's happened, because everyone knows how polarizing this issue has been. So if people want to hate me on the comments, we can debate that later on. Everyone knows how polarizing this issue has been. And so the people who have wanted to attack the people who are protesting the war have blamed social media for the protests. They've blamed, especially TikTok, for the student protests in Australia, in America, etc. They blamed TikTok, but they really blamed all of social media. And so what are the Greens thinking? If they don't get, with the way the bill is worded, that the people who, if this power gets implemented, and the Greens are not in a position to influence the decision-making because they're not in a coalition with the Labor Party or something, and say Peter Dutton comes to power, what don't they get that he wouldn't use this to shut down that kind of discussion that they support, right? And so that's why you don't mess with this stuff. You do not allow a censorship regime like this. And then the other thing we encourage people to do is, because if you really want to help us defeat this bill, understand that we've done really, really well. And if you've done something, you've done really, really well. But we do have to see this through to the end. And so look at our release, call the Greens this week, email the Greens, but especially email them the link that we've provided to Professor Anne Toomey's explanation of the bill. It was exceptional. Did you see that video yet, Martin?
Yeah, I actually put up a show, it's actually here, called Has the Mad, Bad Disinformation Bill Hit the Buffers? And in there, I went through some of the major evidence that went through, including Anne Toomey's. And Anne Toomey's contribution was absolutely good. And of course, she also made a separate show on her own channel as well, which was equally good too. I have to say that the quality of the evidence on the hearing was remarkable from two perspectives. One is the breadth of people who are all saying this is a mad thing to do, and also the stupidity of the government departments trying to defend the indefensible, and even ACMA being completely confused about what it was going to do and how it was going to do it. I mean, it was a laughable journey. And if you want to see a 1 hour summary of that, 8.5 hours, then this here show will give that for you. But no, Anne Toomey was exceptional, and for me, the gap between what's in the bill and what's in the explanatory memorandum, speaks very firmly that there's massive confusion even on the government's mind as to what this thing actually is. And the wriggle room that they've got in the explanatory memorandum gives them carte blanche to do all sorts of pretty disastrous things. So no, Anne Toomey, very worthwhile to listen to.
And that's the thing. The truth lies in the explanatory memorandum, which thank goodness these legal experts like Anne Toomey and the Victorian Bar Incorporated, etc., were able to highlight. But let's just highlight the two relevant examples, just so people understand what the intention is, because it's always been explained to me by politicians. If you want to know the intention of a law, read the explanatory memorandum. Yep. That's how we discovered the bail-in law. Remember, the bail-in law was just this very innocuous wording that was like, maybe what does that mean? Then we read the explanatory memorandum. It was like, yeah, you should be worried about this. This is back in 2017. But one of the things that is considered harmful misinformation is anything that underlines an electoral process. And the examples of that the explanatory memorandum provided were just literally the outcomes of two elections in Europe, one in Germany, one in Italy, that whoever wrote the explanatory memorandum didn't like. I mean, this is the people who wrote this thing are, by their own admission, anti-democratic. They didn't like an election. And Senator Matt Canavan pointed out, and this is bizarre. Right now, we've got all these military exercises because that's what we're the deputy sheriff in the war machine. So this sort of stuff's happening all the time now. But one of the countries out here with Australia right now in military exercises, Martin, is Italy. The explanatory memorandum of this Labor government criticised the election of the current Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, as the result of misinformation, disinformation. I mean, how bloody patronising and insulting can you get? They just don't like the outcome. And it was the same with The Voice, remember? They didn't like the outcome of The Voice. That's got to be misinformation, disinformation. These people are anti-democratic. And they've been caught out by this. So Anne Toomey is not a ranting and raving Robbie Barwick. She is a very measured, truly expert person on constitutional law. And so her video is exceptional. You would do excellent work to help finish off this bill by just flooding the Greens with links to that video and demanding they just, based on that video, justify why they would support this bill. Now, Martin, I got one little piece of information just to make people aware of it that may be a contingency, and that's this: if there's a sniff that with all the backroom wheeling and dealing Labor is going to do, there's talk of an amendment to the bill, which would be better not to be amended. But anyway, it's talk of an amendment to the bill that just carves out all the misinformation, disinformation part of it. And so the only part that's left is the part that, frankly, isn't really the worst thing in the world. The part that requires the tech companies to be transparent about their algorithms.
Yep.
That is in the bill, right? That's if they just wanted to do that, that would be fine. And I think there's a section there where you actually have the right of appeal if you've been sat on social media, right?
Yep.
So that's the stuff that people like David Pocock and all those guys would easily support. So either way, we've got the upper hand here. But let's see this through to the end. And I mean, everyone on this call, make sure you send those emails, make those calls to Green senators this week and next week, and let's just, hopefully get them to the point where it's like, okay, this is not worth it. We're going to be a no vote as well, and the thing is dead, absolutely certainly. And even if that doesn't happen, we've already got the numbers to defeat it. We just got to hope they get to the chamber on time.
Absolutely, and Qantas gets them to Canberra, etc., etc.
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, well,
By the way,
these things happen.
by
Yeah.
the way, little rant. Bloody, I had a potential chance to go to Canberra next week. Um, uh, it wasn't absolutely certain, but part of my scoping it out, and didn't end up happening. But part of my scoping out, I just looked up the flights to Canberra next week. I nearly died. Since Rex has gone, most of the Canberra trips I've done over the last few years, Martin, have been on Rex. They had one flight in and one flight out, way cheaper than everybody else, like $140 for economy, Melbourne to Canberra. Since Rex has gone, everything was like $500 minimum on Qantas to get into Canberra. It's just this country, it is rigged.
Well, talking of rigged, I don't know whether you saw Media Watch this week, but there were a couple of very interesting little pieces there. Remember, of course, that the media is excluded from the misinformation bill, right? As is the academics. Well, academics, they'll fight amongst each other, and you'll always find an academic who will justify any position you want. So, but the point is that Paul Barry went through a couple of items. Firstly, the Amsterdam riots, which were sheeted towards being,
anti-Semitic,
when in
pogroms.
Exactly. And in fact, there was a piece there where Sky made a more objective report about what was actually going on, basically saying, well, that's actually a bit of a two-way street. Some of the charge was led by some of the Jewish continued as well as the others, right? And then blow me, they took that one down and recorded it to slant it more to show that it was anti-Semitic. So that was a very interesting tweak and showing you that you can't trust what you see in the media, and everybody just followed the anti-Semitic flow. And then the other one, which was even in a way more concerning, that there had been an event up in the Northern Territory where spears were being thrown between two groups. And this hit the headlines in the last few days. This event, though, happened years and years ago, and yet was reported as a current event, and nobody actually thought to check. I mean, these are just examples of why you can't trust the mainstream media, and why misinformation and disinformation, if you carve out the mainstream, you're going to get fed a line, and a line that's not going to be questioned.
No, exactly. And so, and then that illustrates what I think is an important discussion around what is the real motivation for this bill. Because, and this is something even the Greens have strongly questioned. Why is mainstream media exempted? They are clearly a major vector for misinformation and disinformation, which is our, modern term for what we used to, Donald Trump labeled it better, fake news, right? It's always been the case. They've been pumping people's heads full of garbage for years. They are always lying. If how do you tell the media's lying? Their lips are moving. I think that's a politician's one as well. But the thing with the mainstream media is there's always been a relationship between the mainstream media and the major parties, or the uniparty is a better way of putting it. And that relationship was able to manage a narrative. And so there's been all through like the modern era of, like the 20th century onwards, at least, right? These big newspapers and whatever. The government could call the media. They call the media bosses. They're always run by big, companies, rich men, right? William Randolph Hearst. Keith Murdoch and Rupert Murdoch, and this is the model. Call them up and do favors for each other. Control the news that way. Now, there's again, you've raised an issue that relates to Gaza, like the controversy around Israel, and that was what the Amsterdam thing was about. But then the other one was just straight out fake news, right? From a very influential media organisation, 2GB, right, the biggest radio station in Australia. And those sort of companies have these cozy relationships with government. I'll give you an example of, it's not always the wrong thing necessarily. I remember when reading the history of World War II, when Darwin was bombed, the Curtin government was really, really concerned about just unleashing total panic in Australia. So Curtin actually brought in the top news chiefs to his confidence, so they knew what was happening. And there was another major operation that he did that kind of thing. So that they'd like to be able to manage this sort of stuff. It's not always for bad, but when it's just out of their self-interest, they love that as well. So what's been happening in Australia for quite a few years now? The major parties have been losing their grip. There is a greater and greater crossbench in the parliament, and that's why they're even, nothing's guaranteed to get through parliament. It used to be just the Democrats were the crossbench, and that was an easy negotiation. Now it's a motley crew. The Greens are the biggest part of it, but One Nation's there, a whole bunch of independents, a whole bunch of ex-major parties guys who are now independents, and they're the crossbench, and they reflect the real feelings of Australians, because that's roughly what the primary vote for the major parties are. They wouldn't be a crossbench if the primary vote hadn't sunk to about a third of the vote for each major party. And so a third of the vote is against the major parties. And the two major parties hate that. And they're blaming that on social media. And they're right to blame it on social media, because through a process like what we're doing now, we can generate real discussion and real analysis about what goes into their lawmaking, and everyone can see how the cookie's made and see what rubbish it is, right? And they don't like that. They've never been under this kind of real scrutiny. I gave an example. We'll talk about this more, but I gave an example at our conference about the regional bank closures inquiry. Here's it's just hilarious to me how the Liberals and the coalition end up jumping on the bandwagon. They'd been in government for 9 years straight, and about 6 months after losing government, they decided to jump on board this regional bank closures inquiry, and they came out swinging. And it was just humorous to me. I said, what have you been doing for 9 years? But I figured it out. They genuinely didn't think they had the right to scrutinise how the private companies like banks run their own businesses. Right? They were really well and truly in their pocket. And then through circumstances, i.e. not wanting the Citizens Party to get all the credit, they jump on board this inquiry, and straight away, they're putting the banks under pressure, and the banks are squirming like crazy. So Matt Comyn goes before the Economics Committee a few months ago, and we dubbed him Crybaby Comyn, because he actually warned that this is a really dangerous problem in Australia, this cynicism about big corporations and the way they extract their profits. That's the term he used, right? He said this is undermining trust in our institutions. Boo hoo hoo. What he was expressing, Martin, was the terror they're feeling about this. They're the establishment, about they are losing their grip. And so between them all, him and actually in that same thing, he blamed misinformation, disinformation. And suddenly Labor comes back with their new version of the bill that includes you can't criticize the banks. Right? We wondered, Elisa, on our show, Elisa Barwick asked the question out loud, did Matt Comyn have something to do with writing the second draft of the bill? Right? Because suddenly you can't have any criticism of the banks. But what really is establishment losing its grip. The mainstream media is exempt because they're in partnership with them to control the narrative. Social media's narrative they can't control. So we should feel good about where we're at. We are the barbarians massing at the gate, but understand this is the power struggle here, right? And that really makes you certain about how motivated they're going to be to try and crush us.
Well, I know somebody who's very much involved in the media in the US. And they were telling me how the mainstream media has quite very strong connections with the security forces in the US and, the CIA and people like that. And in fact, there is a continuity of thought between the political class and the media that nobody talks about, but everybody recognizes to be true. And I think we have the same in Australia, that, when the ABC says we're not going to talk about this, or I've had conversations with very senior reporters and journalists at the ABC who say we can't touch it. It's too electric, right? We know what will happen if we do. And I do note the lack of conversation, discussion, and articles on the misinformation and disinformation bill in the mainstream media. There are a few exceptions, but given the importance of this particular bill, the lack of discussion in the mainstream about this is absolutely remarkable. But remember, of course, they're carved out. So in a way, they want to support it.
And just, of course, 100%. And also, Martin, just the lack of acknowledgement that the reaction to this bill has broken all records. No, I was watching the debates in Parliament, and it's really funny to me because the Liberals have made the right decision, even though they're not genuine, but they've made the right decision. When they get up and participate in the debates, all they got to do is justify the right decision, and it's easy, right? And they're giving very eloquent speeches about the fact that this is about free speech. If they hadn't made the right decision, those same Liberals would have been getting up there and twisting their tongues in knots to come up with some convoluted argument to justify the opposite. But because it's the right decision, it's very straightforward speeches, and every single one of them is highlighting the fact that there were 24,000 submissions to the exposure draft, right? It broke all records. Where's the acknowledgement of that in the media?
Yep.
That you don't even have to come out for or against the bill. Just report the facts of the process. And they don't want to do that. So take it from me, guys. This broke all records. Never seen before in Australian history. And, but we've seen the media behave this way in Australian history, let me assure you. We've seen it so many times. It's not funny. One of the reasons our party's just put out a flyer called "Who Are the Citizens Party and What Have They Ever Done for You?" And we put out that flyer because we've been going for 36 years. And you still get so many people say, I've never heard of the Citizens Party. Well, it's not for want of trying that you've never heard of the Citizens Party. We try very hard to help you hear of the Citizens Party. It is because years ago, the mainstream media, in a coordinated way, figured out the most successful way to combat our party is through a blackout. Don't cover us. And I'll tell you a funny story about how ridiculous this got. And I'll have a little brag here. In the year 2004, here's a bit of Citizens Party history for you. The single biggest donation in the history of Australia at that point was made. It was $1 million. 2004, that was real money back then. That donation was made to the Citizens Party. It wasn't made by a mining billionaire. It wasn't made by a trade union. It wasn't made by a media baron. It wasn't made by some fat little rich kid on a trust fund or something. It was made by a simple farmer from North Queensland who happened to have a windfall because he sold part of his property to Xstrata, the coal mine, and he wanted for his share, and it was election year, and so he donated $1 million to us. Now, what that $1 million taught us is how expensive TV advertising is. We spend it on TV ads in campaigns in Mackay, Newcastle, Launceston, and Western Australia, around Canning in Western Australia, I think. And it went like that. But it was like, we made an impact in those campaigns. We assumed though we would get wall-to-wall media coverage for this extraordinary thing where a simple farmer donated $1 million, biggest single donation in Australian history. Nothing, zero, zilch, nada. Later that year, to get re-elected out of desperation because the Liberals were running out of money, John Howard also got $1 million donation from someone who wasn't even an Australian, a British aristocrat. Lord Michael Ashcroft donated $1 million to the Liberal Party to help them get over the line in the election. That got wall-to-wall coverage. Why wouldn't the media be interested in a simple farmer giving $1 million to the Citizens Party? Because they've always known what a threat we are to their power, because we focus on nothing but their power. What distinguishes the Citizens Party from every other party, Martin, is our focus on here is the corrupting power that means your government who you elect, you can't hold them accountable because they have given up their power to do the things you want to hold them accountable for.
We're a corporate state. And our party from the beginning has been absolutely focused on that, not distracted by anything else. And these people know that. And we've had a lot of success lately outside of elections to really force that to the front, to the fore in the policy debates, etc. And we've been a big factor in a lot of issues that have come to the fore in Parliament, including through these forums with, in collaboration with you, etc. But that's the way the media back then was able to coordinate, keeping us out of the public eye, because they could just say, well, no publicity is bad publicity. So the best way to deal with a threat like that, don't cover them. And if you've ever wondered why you've only heard, I've heard of a party that's been going for 36 years recently, that is what the media does. And social media allowed us to break out of that. Right. So, let that, let that sink in and underscore why we got to defeat this bill.
Yeah. And the social media has allowed democratization to spread in many voices to emerge. Some of those voices you probably want to hear, and some of them will be saying silly things, but overall the net benefit, I think, is positive. The other side of this, of course, and this is the other benefit of the Citizens Party and indeed what DFA does, we go into stuff deep. We actually do the analysis. We actually look at the history. We look at the information. And, my experience is that we know a hell of a lot more than those politicians about any issue that they might be wanting to touch. And that is also a bit like an electric rail, right? It's a bit of a sort of a sharp pain if you touch it. But the point is, we know stuff and we are prepared to tell stories about stuff that make people feel uncomfortable. And that's another part of this whole social media story.
Oh, 100%. One of the secrets of our party, actually, because we get our members to be activists, including engage with politicians. And it's one of the most empowering things you can do the first time is go and take an issue to your local politician and talk to them about it. Because the first thing you will learn is you know more than they do. And that can be surprising at first. You assume that they're pretty smart people who are in those positions. I'm not saying they're dumb, but I'm definitely not saying they're picked because they're the brightest as well. There are some bright people in there, but a lot of them are there to be yes men and women. But even besides that, there's a lot of distractions, so they can't get into things in depth. You know more than they do, and that's what we bring to the process. Very, very important. And we've been able to push these really crucial issues to the front. And now we can talk about some of the announcements that Jim Chalmers has made today, which is a result of, like, in the last few days, it's a result of our work, right? But that work is the combined process of everything we do, including these discussions with you, right? And getting Cookie Boy organised to make submissions, and I'm assuming Cookie Boy always does it every time. He's the best regular. There's probably no appeal to us for submissions or phone calls I've made that he hasn't responded to, and all his compatriots on the chat here. So, but that is and all our members, etc. There's real power in that, and now we're seeing just in the last few days suddenly Jim Chalmers talking about all our issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's go on and talk about that, because, of course, the cash-related issues. So firstly, Russell Broadbank said, finally, cash is crowned king. Today, the government announced that businesses selling essential goods and services will be required to accept cash. And Jason over at Cash Accepted made the point that Chalmers announced new plans to require all businesses in Australia selling food, fuel, medicine and healthcare supplies to accept cash for payment. There is an ongoing place for cash in our society, said Jim Chalmers. Well, I wonder why that has popped up now.
Well, exactly. Now, so can I say, there's no doubt in my mind that the biggest single thing that pushed this to where it is now, such that there's these a couple of big announcements, the cash one and this bank levy, is the regional banking inquiry. Because what the region and the cash welcome campaign. These have all been crucial campaigns as well. Don't get me wrong; they've noticed that. But what the regional banking inquiry did was you have a panel of senators who were able to look into an issue very, very deeply, right? And hold lots of hearings, and the hearings went all day, and they got all the different stakeholders and experts together. And so when that inquiry came down with its recommendations, these things had real weight, and nobody in the parliament could deny that they were the result of a thorough process, right? And I emphasize thorough because I was there. I attended every minute of every damn hearing. Flew all around Australia. Now, those recommendations included, declaring access to banking and cash an essential service, things like that. So now, what the government has announced is definitely in the right direction. And with the cash mandate, it means that whatever fantasy the banks may have had to eradicate cash entirely, and they had a fantasy to do that, no doubt, that is now dead. The war on cash is well and truly being won by us, right? The people who want to save cash. So that's good. I didn't declare then that it has been won, and the reason why is because we get to see these announcements come into law. Some of them are contingent on Labor winning the next election, so we've got to see how the Liberals are going to deal with this, etc. And of course, there's going to be some argy-bargy back and forth between the government and Anna Bligh and the Banking Association about how this plays out. And Jim Chalmers, the guy who made the announcement, regards Anna Bligh as his confidant, right? His good buddy, Anna Bligh. Now, the cash, so less positively, Martin, it's an example of an aspect of Labor, and I'm going to pick on Labor because they're in government, but it's a particularly Labor thing to do as well, where they deal with an issue in a half-assed way. Because the standard is what Andrew G, and I'll give Andrew G a plug here. So Andrew G is a former Liberal who became an independent. He's a member for Clare. The former National Party, but independent member for Clare now in New South Wales. He put up the bill to require all businesses to accept cash, and it was seconded by Bob Catter and supported by Di Lee, the independent member for Fowler in Sydney. And this was about 6 months ago. So they put up that bill to do that. Their bill was quite thoughtful. It allowed exemptions, but only specific exemptions in specific instances. They wanted all businesses to accept cash. What Chalmers has come up with here is a bill that requires all businesses that sell essential goods and services to accept cash, but all small businesses exempt it. And the question is why, right? For what good reason is small business exempted? Doesn't make sense. Here's the original bill. Andrew G has said that Labor did not engage with him on the bill. They just come up with this. So what they've done is they've seized the initiative, if I can call it that, to look like they're doing something, and they've come up with something that, yes, it's a step in the right direction. It's got to be implemented after the election, though. So we have to see if it will be, and if they lose the election, will Liberals. But still, nevertheless, it's half-assed. That's the issue. And the other thing with the bank levy is similar. So they've got a bank levy that they've announced where the banks that close branches will subsidise the banks in regional Australia that keep them open. And it's been described as like a carbon trading scheme, right? So the banks that close branches will buy bank closure credits, equivalent carbon credits from the banks that keep them open, and that will help subsidise them. And what it doesn't do is open more branches. That's what it doesn't do. And now, this is actually somewhat similar to a recommendation in the Regional Bank Closures Inquiry report, and it's fine as far as it goes, but Martin, it was the weakest recommendation. What Labor hasn't done, our friend Dale Webster has made a point about this on her website. Dale Webster's the independent journalist who did the most to document the real extent of bank branch closures around Australia. What Labor hasn't done is what it's supposed to do, which is make a response to the Senate inquiry's report within 90 days. That's the rules of the Senate. They hand down a report. Labor has 90 days, 3 months. The government has 3 months to respond. They just ignore it. So instead of responding and saying, okay, here's our policy response to this, they do these little fixes. They try and take approach of little fixes. Now, what that tells me is they're hoping to, their real motivation is not to fix the problem, it's to diffuse the anger politically, the political anger.
Yep.
Right. So yes, don't get me wrong, it's in the right direction, but why, Labor? Why? Don't you want to get re-elected? Show the people that you want to solve problems. I can't think of one thing they've done in government that hasn't been half-assed and just ends up angering everybody. Pick a side, solve the problem. And, that's Labor. Now, that said, I got, thanks to this regional bank closures inquiry, Martin, what I said before about the mainstream media, this is one issue that it's allowed the Citizens Party to break through, especially on commercial radio, the big commercial radio stations, the Channel 9 network. So for the last 18 months, I've been such a regular on 6PR in Perth, 5AA in Adelaide, and even quite a few times 3AW here in Melbourne, which is a very big one. A couple of times 2GB in Sydney. But Perth and Adelaide, they get me on quite regularly. Every time there's a cash or banking issue, call Robert Barwick and I'm on there. This week, the other day, yesterday actually, when I got on 5AA in Adelaide, they booked me to talk to before they booked Stephen Jones, the minister, the financial services minister. So I went first, and then he listened. He had to listen to me, and he went second. And he's announcing these policies and putting a good face on them. But he said two things that were quite important in a good way in that interview. One thing he said was that the regional bank closures inquiry did a very good job. So it was good to hear the government acknowledging that. The second thing was the next announcement they're going to make will be about face-to-face banking services. And this is where it's going to get interesting because, you and I have recently talked about the fact that one of the good signs coming out of the Senate inquiry was it recommended an expert panel to be convened to look at a government bank to operate through post offices. On the 29th of August, the Australian newspaper reported a government bank operating out of Australia Post back on Labor's agenda. And that's since been confirmed by somebody to this same Stephen Jones, the minister. He's confirmed that they're in discussion about it. So if this happens, this is a massive victory for our campaign, right? We went into this campaign to get this outcome, to get a public bank back, and the best model is one that operates through post offices. Now, the problem is, so I'm looking forward to the announcement, but the question is, will Labor do it right and do it in such a way that they can come up with a powerful institution that's the fifth pillar in the Australian banking system that really takes competition up to the banks, and that competition alone is enough to make the banks actually start behaving properly in regional areas and not just stop closing branches but reopen them? Or are they going to do the same half-assed approach as with these other announcements? Whatever they do, we will keep pushing, don't get me wrong, right? Once you've got a foot in the door, you've got a foot in the door, and we can always enlarge it. But that's what I'm, chewing my nails about. What's Labor going to do with this one?
And without giving too much away, Robbie, I will say that we've been doing a bit of primary consumer research on this question of a postal bank. And so we basically asked in our surveys people's attitudes towards the idea of having an alternative bank, a postal bank that effectively would provide services in the local area. And the initial results, we're still running the survey at the moment, show massive support in the community for an alternative to the existing banks that are there at the moment. It's strongest in the regional areas as you would expect, but is also quite strong even in the cities And so it's pretty much across the whole of the country. So that'll be quite a powerful stake in the ground as we accumulate more information from our surveys. We're running it each week at the moment to show that there is actually not only political motivation for doing this from the inquiry, but also community support for doing it. And, politicians should be smelling the wind here and understanding that this is actually something which could be a vote winner.
They sure should. But remember, we're up against this power of vested interests, and they're not going to go away. They're not going to voluntarily just retreat and say, okay, people, have your government back.
No, indeed. And we know that the banks are lobbying very heavily behind the scenes, as they always do. They spend a lot of money, time, and effort, ponying up to the political parties, all of the political parties, the major political parties, not just one or the other. It's basically spreading the love everywhere, and always exerting influence, as the major gas cartels do, as the major supermarkets do, as the major airlines do. Pretty much the whole of government is lobbied almost incessantly by corporate interests, the resources sector being another one. And so what we have to do is to recognize that lobbying goes on. But what we're trying to do here is to get the people's voice to really come up and be a good counterpoint to those corporate messages. And because ordinary people in Australia are hurting at the moment, really hurting, and they're really frustrated with what's been happening with regard to taxes and government and all of those things. And I think the US election actually was a really interesting observation. A lot of people voted because their own financial and personal situation has been degraded dramatically over recent times. And I think that's something worth understanding, because when it comes to the next election, whilst there will be a lot of big picture issues and, and woke issues and all things that people may want to talk about, it is actually the economy, Stu. It is actually ordinary households. And in fact, did you see this? The RBA came out and said that the distressed home sales are rising, according to the RBA. Number of homes being put up for sale because owners are financially distressed is rising. This is despite higher property prices cushioning the impact of many borrowers. And borrowers who are experiencing persistent difficulties servicing their mortgages and with no further options to adjust their finances may decide to sell their home, Chris Kent, the RBA's assistant governor, said. And of course, this is in the context, Robbie, of interest rates being higher for longer. Post-Trump, of course, we've seen yields rising. And very interestingly, we're seeing, of course, the expectations of rate cuts in Australia being kicked out into way next year now. Even CBA's finally conceded it ain't happening this year. Maybe May, maybe later. And of course, it's worth highlighting, of course, that this election has to be by May. Probably will be sooner than that. Might be a double dissolution election. Who knows? But the point is that this is a big deal. So if you think about everything that's been going on and the context of what we've been saying, the voice of people and the fact that a lot of people are actually finding it really difficult to get by at the moment economically because of bad policy, high migration and a few other things too, it's all coming home to roost now. And so I think the object lesson of the US is also worth playing back through into Australia when it comes to how the election may play out. And some of the agenda items that people will be thinking about will be the hip pocket, will be the economics, it will be how well am I off now compared with a few years ago, rather than some of these other issues.
Yeah, and did you see with the US election, and we were strung along because they tried to make it out it was going to be close, and it was nowhere near close. He romped it in. But despite what you've said, people clearly voted with their hip pocket. But despite what you said, then the commentary in the media, especially the anti-Trump kind of media, the more respectable mainstream media, was, yeah, but look at the figures. The economy's not that bad. And I'm thinking, then what is wrong with you people? You've had something much more powerful than your statistics prove to you that it is that bad, right? You don't get a vote like that if it's good. You idiots are looking at your statistics and saying, oh, look at this figure, this figure, this figure. It's not that bad. And that's exactly how the Labor Party rolls. So the Labor Party, and and I'm not saying that to be a fan of Liberals, but the Labor Party They have this was I remember this from the Gillard Rudd years as well. They convinced themselves that it's not the way people are feeling that's the problem. We're solving all their problems. It's just our messaging. We're not getting the news through to them. You wouldn't have to get the news through to them if you were solving their problem. They would feel it.
Well, Robbie, just link that directly back to the misinformation, right? If they can try and control the information, they will try and get those messages out, and the other stuff won't get out. That's another reason why, from a free speech perspective, we need to have this. So there is a direct connection with our earlier conversation here.
And the power of what we're trying to do is plug everybody in to the things that we literally should all have in common. We need a functioning economy. We need banking services, right? We need more affordable energy. We need, affordable housing. I was going to say lower interest rates. It's a slightly different argument than lower interest rates. Crushed home buyers need interest rate relief, that's for sure. But the real issue is you don't want to go back to the 0.1% interest rates. That's just lunacy. What we need to do is get more affordable housing, so reasonable interest rates don't crush people is what we actually need, right? These things are what like there would be a tiny 0.1% on the fringe that shouldn't agree with all that. And that's why they got to. You said something quite profound. That's why they got to keep us divided by this emphasis on what people call the woke stuff or whatever, right? I have to warn the viewer here, if you're a fan of Sky News, get your head read. Sky News will feed back to you exactly all your fears about the woke agenda, and you'll feel reassured there's people on TV who agree with you. But something owned by Rupert Murdoch, who was on the board of the neoliberal think tanks in the 90s, actually on the board that dismantled our economy through privatization and deregulation, got rid of our industries, got rid of our manufacturing, got rid of our ownership of our own assets, got rid of the Commonwealth Bank, got rid of Qantas, got rid of Telstra, right? I just upgraded my broadband, and there's a public company named NBN comes and upgrades your broadband. And we had to start it up because we got rid of the other one, right, called Telstra, which used to be they literally dismantled our economy. They made government less functional because they took away the things government did, telling us this was always going to make us more efficient. Instead, we're a basket case. He is not going to tell you the truth. So what he has is a professional 24-hour news operation to keep you distracted on whether there's trans people playing in women's sports. And trust me, I'm not defending that at all, but understand it's the incessant obsession about that is making you not realize that everyone on your street should be on the same pages with you about, do we want to actually get our economy back here? And so what the Citizens Party tries to do is push out the universal issues that everyone should get behind, because it's those universal issues such as just that we want basic services to work, please, right? That's how you can actually bring back government to its job. So beware those voices that are a distraction from that. That's not to diminish those issues. I'm just talking about the repetition where that's all they talk about. Because those voices, all they want you to do is get mad enough that you vote their Liberals back in. And then when it's time, they'll play the game, and just like people like Chris Minns, the Labor member Premier for New South Wales, and Nicholas Rees, the Labor Mayor of Melbourne here. Why? You know why they got elected, Martin? Because they did their apprenticeship on Sky News too. Sky News made them acceptable to the public. So now they're in there and they're just as useless as the other one. Look at Chris Minns and the toll roads in New South Wales. He promises he's going to solve the toll roads problem. He gets that actually good guy, Professor Alan Fells, to write the report. And all Alan Fells wanted to do was write in the report a very relevant section, which was to project how much money the toll roads were going to make in the future. And Chris Minns wouldn't let him publish it, right? Because Chris Minns is part of the club, because he did his apprenticeship on Sky News, supposed enemies of Labor. No, they're enemies of Labor. They're enemies of the people. Donald Trump is right.
They're enemies of the people. All of them are. I'm not just thinking, I'm just saying for I'm assuming a certain conservative audience here that might get sucked into that kind of stuff. They're distracting us from the real issues. The real issues starts and begins with the economy. That's where we're being robbed on a daily basis. And we can build a grand coalition in Australia around that. Our party has collaborations with the Greens, with One Nation, with the Independents, even with individuals in Parliament inside the major parties. We don't collaborate on everything, but we collaborate on these core issues that revolve around the economy that affect everybody, right? And I think if we can build this grand coalition around these issues, which we're doing. Our whole discussion so far has been about the policies we've pushed onto this government. I've complained about their half-assed, but they wouldn't have it without us. They just would not have happened without us, without this process. We need to keep that up and not get distracted by these other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think distraction and what I call misdirection is something worth understanding, right? So if there's a thing that people don't want you to see, what they do will create another thing over there and throw a lot of time and effort and money at it. Like The Voice, for example, I would argue that's a good example of distraction and misdirection, right? Massive amount of political time and effort going to something. Now, there might be some laudable aims in the middle of it, but actually for ordinary people who are in Australia, as in other countries, finding it really, really hard to get ahead, and cost of living continues to rise. All of those things are making it very, very hard. And by the way, just sort of small aside, but I'm going to have a bit of a rant here. Did you notice this? Forthcoming correction to childcare costs in this consumer price index. The ABS has recently identified it made errors in estimating the impact of the government's reforms to increase the rate of childcare subsidies and its eligibility parameters when they took effect. So they're going to make some changes to the CPI. Now, I have to tell you, I am shocked. No, I'm not shocked. I'm not shocked and surprised at all. We know that the real numbers, what people are really feeling, are way off what the official statistics are at the moment. And in fact, if you take account of the cost of living, including mortgage or rent, which of course aren't in the, fully in the official statistics, probably mortgages, we know that the real CPI is probably 6, 7, or 8 at the moment, rather than 2 or 3, right? So once again, what you're doing is you're getting a story which isn't the full story.
Yeah. And explain to me, if you're a government, like Labor's a one-term government. Do they want to be a one-term government? If you're a government, goes back to my early point. You want to solve problems, don't you? So it doesn't take you and me, Martin, sitting here to know that the headline inflation figure does not equal the cost of living. Right?
Yep.
So do you want to actually solve the problem? Do you want to make a difference for people? Don't go, we've increased it by CPI, right? It's BS. Solve the problem. But Labor, this is what I was criticizing about Labor's approach. All they do is say, like with Trump, like with the Democrats, no, we're doing this, we're doing that, the economy's doing really well. No, it's absolutely not. And even when you think you're addressing something that's of a pressing issue, it's just pathetic in that way. Look, what it illustrates is how this Uni Party works. They don't represent the people, right? Now, we had we can talk about this more in a minute, but we had our national policy launch on Sunday, Martin. As you saw, some of it was live streamed. The theme was called "Return Government to the People, Take Back National and Economic Sovereignty." And by sovereignty, we mean what puts the people in charge, so that the government we elect is accountable to us. And that's why I rant so much about these bloody relationships between the government and these private corporations, that they've outsourced the functions of government to these corporations. And so the things that piss us off on a daily basis, the government doesn't know how to do anymore. They used to know how to do all this stuff. They don't know how to do it anymore. And they say, no, that's not a government function now. That's a private electricity company or whatever. And we therefore can't hold them accountable.
Mm.
And if we can't hold them accountable, we're not in charge. We don't have economic sovereignty in Australia. And we make the same argument about our foreign policy. We don't have national sovereignty because we've outsourced that to the Yanks and the Brits through AUKUS and long before AUKUS actually, but etc. We are not in charge of our own decision making. We could be. We need to assert it, but it's got to come from the people to do that. And the real pressing issue to make that happen is this understanding that this economy will never serve us until we actually get that power back. And that's the nub of the fight.
Spot on. And that's ever more important. I've always had the view that democracy essentially means that the politicians are at the bottom of the pyramid supporting and enabling society and community and businesses and people to thrive and survive, right? Rather than actually the other, which is a top-down thing, where effectively they try and impose. And quite often, in fact, what they're imposing is an agenda which is set not just within Australia, but an international agenda, whether it's, as you say, the Yanks or whatever, or whether it's actually the IMF and the other, non-elected people who actually think they know better, the technocrats who think they know what the future should be. I think there's quite a lot going on at the moment. And some of those top-down directives, including this information, as we touched on earlier on, and the way that the economy should work, is not actually in the interests of ordinary people. So it has to be turned on its head, and that means that democracy has to come back. And that's the first point. The second point is, given what we know about the US, and I made a show on this the other day, you can forget certainty, you can forget lower interest rates. The Fed is now even saying that maybe they're not going to cut rates. And the reason for that is that the Trump tariff story and the Trump higher inflation story and more debt story is going to have a hugely profound impact on not just the US, but on us too. And we are not in a good position in Australia because of the very high energy costs that we've got, because of the fact that our manufacturing sector has pretty much, been thrown to the dogs, because of the fact we've got a lot of households who are actually struggling to get by, a lot of small businesses that are losing money and going out of business, and we've got a huge demand on housing that we can't meet at the moment, as well as other things. And then we've got the China connection and the question of the economic, flows to and from China. All those things mean that we are highly exposed in Australia to some of these things. And unless we can find a different way of thinking about the problem, we're going to perpetuate a society where tax continues to go up, where there are less and less services for ordinary people, that more and more jobs will be created by government and will be in the government sector rather than the private sector. Productivity will continue to degrade and go down, and effectively the GDP per capita, in other words, the measure of wealth, the share of the cake per individual, will continue to drop, which is what's happened for the last few years. And by the way, real incomes have also dropped for most people in real terms over the last decade plus. So it's not like we're actually basing the future on success. What we're doing at the moment is basing the future on massive failure over 20, 30, 40 years, bad policy, neoliberalism, the deregulation of the financial system, which benefited the financial players around the earth, the international thrust, particularly to the US. All of those things have not done Australia and Australians well, which is why we need a different story.
Yeah. Anthony Albanese is clearly nervous about Trump, and Rudd's nervous about Trump and finding out what they used to say. That Trump seems to know what Rudd used to say about him. We all saw what Albanese used to. I've actually been looking forward to this time, Martin, when it looked like Trump might win. I was looking forward to this because what we're watching now is Labor is Albo do like a 10-meter dive, with a double twist and a pike and whatever to land with his lips firmly on Trump's butt. Because when Trump was in office last time, Labor was in opposition and they had the luxury to be quite snide about Trump because of Trump's character and, all that kind of stuff. But in a way they would never do in government because they're just as big a suckholes to the Americans as the Liberals are, right? And now we're going to see it. And so what has Albo said already about in relation to Trump and the tariffs? His message is, Mr. Trump, Australia deserves to be exempt from that because, look, Mr. Trump, you have a trade surplus with us, right? And think about what that means for a minute. I've been highlighting this for years. Yeah, they do have a trade surplus with us. That means America makes a profit just from the trade alone with Australia. On top of that, it's the biggest foreign investor in Australia, and so it gets to take all those profits out of Australia from its foreign investments. And with the whole AUKUS malarkey, not only have we turned ourselves into a military base for the Americans, where we've got the nuclear subs in Perth, the nuclear bombers in Darwin, B-2 stealth bombers in Brisbane, Pine Gap, etc. But you got this thing called the Inflation Reduction Act, where we gave the American president all this direct power over our resources. And so they got their tentacles stretching out to control Australia's resources, the things that we actually make money from. They're gonna use that power to, when in future projects, freeze any Chinese involvement out of those future projects. The people who actually pay us money, remember who we're talking about with China. They pay us money, about $120 billion a year net profit from dealing with them. We pay the Americans about $40 billion a year for the pleasure of trading with them. And all Albo can do is get down and genuflect to Trump, because the relationship illustrates what you've said about just how desperate we are as an economy. When what we should be doing is acknowledging, yes, we've got ourselves into this right raw mess here. How do we turn it around? How do we give ourselves start growing a manufacturing base so that we can have some import substitution, not be so desperately dependent on imports, etc., when all these trade wars go off again and whatnot? How could we play a more independent role in international diplomacy and trade diplomacy and those sort of things, so that a country like America, has Australia pushing back at some point and saying, hang on, that's not in our interests. And if we say so publicly, your public will think that you're screwing over Crocodile Dundee down here, their favorite cousin kind of thing, right? Actually put up an independent voice on these things for once and have an input into the American debate that way. That's not to say, like, I actually don't have a specific criticism of Trump's intention for his own economy. He's depends on who he appoints and all that kind of thing, right? But see, he's trying to do the same thing there, or at least he says rhetorically he's trying to do the same thing there that we should be thinking about doing here. How do we get, you can't get all your industries back. A part of the went to the rest. There's a brilliant Iraqi restaurant inside the complex that used to be the Ford factory facility here in Melbourne in Broadmeadows. So the Ford factory massive facility, covered acres and acres and acres. And so in one of the service roads, some enterprising Iraqi family have started a really brilliant restaurant. We were just there the other day. But when you go there, I've been there a few times, but you now go past acre after acre after acre of empty paddock to get there. And all those paddocks used to be big production sheds for Ford. The center of Australian manufacturing used to be in those, those paddocks. We're not going to get them back by putting up tariffs in Australia. That's not how we're going to do it. But we have to have an intention to do things, and scope it out, but make it our intention. I can't predict how everything would work out, but scope it out and make it our intention so we can do these things. I have this shout out to Paul Gendra. I hope you're watching, Paul. My mate, my Czechoslovakian mate here in Melbourne is an engineer who told me something really profound. I've told you on this show before, but in 2020 in lockdown, Paul used to call me up because he was an essential service. He's an engineer, and it was never easier for him to get around Melbourne because we're all in lockdown. But these people were really busy because of the supply chain problems. Suddenly, all the domestic engineering businesses in Australia were run off their feet. The big companies needed parts, and they needed them now, and they had to turn to locally instead of sourcing them overseas. And Paul's the guy who said to me, the $5 billion, the billions and billions of dollars that we're spending on JobKeeper to pay people to sit home. He said, if you take $5 billion, share it among 1,000 small engineering firms in Australia, and say, here you go, here's $5 million each to get your product to market. You're not allowed to spend it on a house. You're not allowed to spend it on a car. Get your product to market, because he said, look, a lot of these engineers are no good at business. They're good at making things. They're no good at business. So he said, look, you would have some would fail, some would succeed, but he said 5 would become bigger than BHP. That's the potential that exists in Australia. If they just have some support to get to do the back end economic stuff to get it to where it needs to go. But we're a country that hasn't done that. We've lost so many great inventions in this country because we have our system for the last 40 years has absolutely refused to back anything here in Australia. Those solar panels that are being manufactured in China for all around the world, they were designed in the bloody University of New South Wales, and they couldn't get backing here in Australia. And there's case after case after case of that sort of thing. So that's the sort of these are the shifts that we need, right? We can do these things if we actually bring back that intention, because we bloody well need it. We absolutely need it, or else we're toast in this country. And everything we've talked about in this more international context, Martin, is all about the economics of it. Add to that the danger of war, right? Which we're contributing to by just being a suckhole and going along with it so far. World war that threatens to be nuclear war, and it's curtains for everybody. So the shift in thinking has to be really universal here, and our country has to own up to our role in it and the fact that we need that shift too. Don't just blame these other countries, and no, own up to our role in it, and let's have a shift in thinking and go back to making the system work for everyone.
Yeah, and so it's about priorities, and it's about objectives. I think it's probably about objectives beyond the sort of the normal political cycle, because it seems to me that actually the big problem we have is that the politicians are only worrying about the next election and whether they get voted back in. And I know getting into power is important, but if that becomes an end in itself, then what you do is you end up going where the money is. You basically follow the easy path rather than actually the right path. And I would argue that over the last 20 to 30 years, that's the problem that we've actually been facing, where the political processes and systems have actually not worked well for ordinary people. But it's actually about getting re-elected and keeping the status quo. The uni party, and the more and more I see these two major parties, they are the same. They've got a different label, different color, but most of the policies are pretty much the same. So we have to find a way of breaking that nexus to be able to actually go to somewhere different. And I want to just come back to the other point that you made. The international context here is quite critical, right? So we are in a situation where the international risks are probably rising. We've got the BRICS group becoming a little bit more focused and actually doing a little bit more, although there's still some interesting pressures there as well. We've got the US, who's losing a lot of the argument about what its future is, and is, I think, a little bit desperate to try and, change the game up or change it differently. And, it's another reason perhaps why Trump got in. The trouble is Australia's going to get caught in the crossfire if we're not jolly careful, both economically and maybe even worse. And that's why this is a really important conversation.
Yes. At our conference on Sunday, one of our speakers was John Shipton, the father of Julian Assange. And one of the things that John was able to talk about was the BRICS conference. He was one of only 2 Australians who attended it. And this was a conference representing 40% of the world's population. I mean, the BRICS has grown very, very large. Yep. It's got the majority of the world's oil production is represented by the BRICS, right? The countries like Australia sneer at this process at their peril. That is the world's center of gravity. It's bigger than the G7. The BRICS, in terms of economic size, is bigger than the G7, and not surprising because it includes China and India. Now, China and India are 2 countries that the Americans, with our support, have tried hard to pry apart and get at loggerheads. The really big news on that front is they they came to an agreement at the beginning of the BRICS event to resolve their main issue, which is their border dispute, which is actually a legacy of the old British Empire, of course. There's a lot of disputes around the world that the British Empire left in its wake. This was quite profound, because if that thing can be resolved, that burr in the saddle can be removed, then this is 1.4 billion people, and now China and India more than 1.4 billion people. That is incredibly dynamic, and that alone defines the center of economic gravity for the world. And of course, you've got the Russians and etc. involved in that. Now, the BRICS are trying to be very constructive. Actually, they are doing all this work on a BRICS payment system. I won't say a BRICS currency, because they're not actually saying a BRICS currency per se. They're at pains to say they're not trying to replace the US dollar in a way that sabotages it, because they don't want to blow up the world economy, right? So the US dollar is the reserve dollar, but the reserve currency. But they are looking for more and more alternatives to that, and developing something that can be independent, so the Americans can't use the US dollar as a weapon. And that process is well and truly underway. In a bilateral way, there's lots of trading that's now done completely independent of the US dollar. Trump knows how fundamentally important this is. This is one area where he's threatening to an economic war over this, because he knows if they did pull the rug out from under the US dollar, America's toast. Now, what Trump needs to do is read his briefs, because they're actually not threatening to do that. All right, so that's quite important. But why was, back to John Shipton, why, here's with such a huge process, why is only one, essentially there was two Australians there, the guy was someone John took with him. Why is that the case? Right? This is lunacy on our part. We don't have to join. We advocate, Citizens Party says we should be joining BRICS. Right? It's an economic cooperation thing. You're not giving up your sovereignty when you join something like BRICS. It's economic cooperation. But of course, Big Daddy says no, so we're not going to do that. But that defines a lot of the problems for Australia. So now we're at the mercy of whatever Trump does. Now, can I just to say a few things on Trump? You're seeing some extraordinary developments now that he's been elected. That, in my view, are the evil people in the world trying to preempt the one or two things that he might possibly do good, such as bring an end to this bloody war in Ukraine finally, which should never have been fought, right? And the reason he can bring an end to it is because, unlike his predecessors, he acknowledges correctly what the problem was. The problem is Russia is saying to America, you don't tell us what to do. You would demand security guarantees for you. No one's up in your face putting weapons on your border, so you don't do that to us. And when America didn't take Russia seriously, they said, well, we do whatever we like. Well, it's been a long time since you shouldn't take Russia seriously. And Vladimir Putin has just shown, no, you don't do whatever you like, but you give us the guarantees that Zelensky was willing to give within a month of the war, before the Brits and Americans stopped him from doing it. Right? I had an argument with someone the other day who said, are you saying Zelensky's not a Democrat? I said, no. He's banned elections. He's banned the 16 opposition political parties now. He's just doing what he's being told. But now that Trump is in a position to do something, coming up, this whole thing should be getting ready for a Trump presidency. Instead, the news out of America, and we're trying to get the actual confirmation of details, is Biden has actually approved the thing. And when I say those words, everyone listening should realize, well, clearly if Biden's approved it, someone else really did it. He's not running the show. That dottery old geriatric is not in charge at all. But the people who want to blow up the world said, okay, the one thing that would really escalate this is to allow American-made weapons to be fired by the Ukrainians into Russia with technology that requires American guidance systems to do it. And the Russians said, if you do that, then that means Russia and America are directly at war. The very thing that that Ukraine was used as a proxy to avoid, so that you didn't have the clash between the two biggest nuclear-armed superpowers in the world. And that is what they've just approved. This is lunacy. This has put the world really on the edge, closer than it's actually ever been. And our country, the yes men that we are, I'm convinced that there's I've seen some of Anthony Albanese's history. Before he became Prime Minister, he was capable of engaging on these things and having independent opinions. But now as Prime Minister, he's just in lockstep. Yes, sir. And we are aiding and abetting a mad regime blowing up the world. Trump isn't the problem here. Now, my friends in the Greens launched a bloody motion today in Parliament, Martin, to debate, now that Trump's president, Australia should break the US alliance. What? Why do you wait for Trump to be president to do that? In fact, these foreign policy things that Trump is promising, he might be a horrible person domestically, but that doesn't affect Australia. It's his foreign policy that affects Australia. And his foreign policy is, if he follows through on it, I'm not saying he will, but if he follows through on it, his foreign policy at least has some actual potential, if in this case, to end a war, a really bad war that we've donated $1 billion towards, right? So, Australia, unless we actually get some independence here, we're going to be in trouble. And then now to say something against Trump, I don't know what he's going to do vis-a-vis China. I do know, I don't hate the guy, but I'll say this. If he surrounds himself, 5 of the 7 appointments he's made so far to foreign policy positions are utter disasters. These are people who universally want a war with China. And the only one I'll applaud is Tulsi Gabbard, who's the Director of National Intelligence, because Tulsi Gabbard made a name for herself being the most courageous congresswoman to criticize, long before Trump did, the never-ending wars and the regime change wars, etc. So it's good that she's in that position. So if Trump starts a war with China that he expects to fight from Australia's shores, then he's my enemy, because that will destroy our country like it's destroyed Ukraine. And this is again where it's not about hating on Trump. It's about, the issue is not Trump. The issue is Australia. Are we going to be independent or not? And people who have got sucked into this China agenda for a long time, you need to take stock of some of the things I'm telling you. And one of those things to take stock of is, how come Paul Keating, Malcolm Fraser would never in a million years have accepted Australian US Marines in Darwin, nuclear submarines in Perth, B-52 bombers in Darwin. They would never, they were always Trump, they were always America's allies, these people, Martin, always. Malcolm Fraser was America's ally at the second hotspot of the Cold War. Paul Keating was America's ally. But they would never have allowed their ally to put those facilities here. You know why? Because that's what you do in a war. And they didn't want to be in a war. So we've done it without being in a war, because it means we are allowing ourselves to become the base for a war, because we don't have an independent foreign policy. We don't have national sovereignty in this country. And if that goes pear-shaped, that trumps all other issues, because the Pine Gap, Russia recently put us on a list of 47 countries that are hostile to Russia. They released this list. They did it for a reason. They're sending a message. If these particular American missiles in Ukraine are called ATACMS, if those ATACMS are fired deep into Russia, they will require guidance from Pine Gap. Do you know what that means? It means the Russians are within their rights to send their own missile over to the Northern Territory to knock Pine Gap out. That's what that means. And if we go into a war with China and America's got all its bloody arsenal established in Australia, those missiles from China are going to be raining down on us. And this is just nuts. I hope people agree with that. So, what's the issue? The issue is independent foreign policy. The issue is getting a message to parliamentarians so they turn around and say, all right, someone get on the phone to Trump and say, okay, you have a peace initiative, we're going to support it. But if your advisors are telling you that they've got Australia sewn up, we're going to be your base in the war, forget it. Take your stuff out of here. We don't want it. That's our best way of contributing to world peace.
Indeed. Well, it's a really concerning time, and certainly the doomsday clock is closer than it's been for quite some time, and for these reasons. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And I agree that Australia needs to have a better handle on its own international policies rather than just being the poodle, which is what it's been for a long time. And
the poodle, yep.
Yeah, and talking of poodles, there's another one I just want to touch on before we end. Energy policy, right? We have a ridiculous energy policy in Australia at the moment. Our energy price is very high because we are pricing electricity off the marginal price of gas. Marginal price of gas is being set by the international gas exporters. That's our stuff being sold to the international market, and now we're actually looking like we're going to have to import it back into Australia. So the energy strategy for Australia is also another very important policy area, which I think again needs major rework.
Well, we're in our policy launch. We've called for a nationalised electricity company that can also encourage the states to renationalise their electricity. I'll give you a little bit of context. So until 2009, the Citizens Party had a really profound relationship with a great engineer named Lance Endersby. And Lance was a power engineer, and he had started his career while he was still a student at Melbourne University building the Snowy Mountain scheme. Quick aside, he always told a great story about that. The Hudson, the engineer who was in charge of the scheme, he sent Lance and his colleagues over to America to tour the Tennessee Valley Authority and learn everything they could. And when they came back, he said, "What did you learn?" And they said, "Well, everything they do, we can do here too." And he said, "Exactly. That's why I sent you. You already know what to do." He sent them so they could get some confidence. Anyway, so this was transformative for Lance, and then he went after the Snowy Mountain scheme. He helped build the Tassie Hydro scheme. He went to Southeast Asia and built dams in the Mekong Delta and stuff like that. And then when he finished his career as the professor of engineering at Monash University, and he got so demoralized by, in those days, in the late 80s, all of his students were always doing engineering as one of two options. The other one was usually commerce, because none of them were confident they'd get a job actually in engineering, right? They thought they'd have to pursue business careers. And so he spent his own super to travel around Australia scoping out these great economic development ideas. And our party worked very hard to help promote those ideas, and a lot of people are aware of the concepts because of the work we did. Lance always liked to point out that when they finished the Snowy Mountain scheme, they priced the electricity quite simply. They just amortized the debt on the scheme, such as it was, and to pay it off. And the electricity was set just so that the unit price covered the cost of the scheme and the debt, basically covered the cost of the debt. And there was your electricity price. And that's how electricity was priced forever in Australia, because it was always developed by state enterprises that, I know brown coal was dirty, but it was actually brown coal in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria was an engineering marvel when they developed it. They found a way to burn glorified mud, right? Cheapest energy in the world. The hydro schemes, etc. The biggest issue is not the form of energy it was that it was in public hands. It wasn't there to make a profit. It was there to provide a service to the country, so the country made a profit. And that was one of Australia's competitive advantages. And in 1992, Martin, the Productivity Commission did a report criticising Australia's electricity system, and they had three criticisms. One criticism was that it employed too many people. So the Latrobe Valley in Victoria had too many apprentices. They thought that was a bit over the top. Another criticism was there was cross subsidisation. the city people paid a cent a kilowatt more, so the country people could pay a cent a kilowatt less. And another criticism was it produced too much electricity. There was an abundance of electricity. They did not say it was too expensive. They admitted in the report that we still had the cheapest electricity in the world. So in other words, they had to get so anal to find these three problems with our electricity system. And their conclusion was to solve these three problems, we have to corporatize it and then privatize it. Now, you and your viewers tell me 30 years later, has that improved our electricity system? We've gone from cheapest electricity in the world, where there's an abundance of electricity and there's plenty of electricians being trained as apprentices in the Latrobe Valley, to absolutely goddamn chaos. I mean, seriously. So don't try and tell me there's little fiddles you can do. Yes, the fact we've even got it on a bloody mechanism with the gas is ridiculous. That should have been broken ages ago. It is an absolute crime we're allowing this gas cartel to plunder us, to gouge us. It is the energy equivalent, Martin, of what the British did to Ireland in 1845 to 1849 famine. Because what most people don't realise is the only thing that went bad in that famine was the bloody potatoes. Ireland was producing enormous quantities of food on the estates owned by absentee British landlords. And the British Army was there to make sure that food got from the farms to the ports to go and be eaten in England, and the Irish people who were starving couldn't touch it. We have that with gas. We cannot afford gas in Australia because the cartel says, no, we've got to export it to a country like Japan, which on-sells our gas and makes a profit because they're getting it so cheap, and no one's going to break this ridiculous cycle, right? So there's no solution here that does not involve the government. And this is what all my libertarian friends out here, get this through your head. Only the government can fix this. Get your stupid free market fanaticism out of your bloody head. You're the idiots that stuffed up the system. You believed all this neoliberal garbage. Only the government can fix it. And because you libertarians take all the effort, all the attention off the government, it never gets done. We are being gouged here. People are dying because they can't afford power. And all it takes is the government to say, okay, the charade's over. Gas cartel, you're gone. Pass the law, you're gone. Nationalise it, you're gone. Set the price to just cover the cost. Everyone's got power again. That's what it's going to take. No other bullshit. Cut the bullshit, Australia. While we've been bullshitting on this, we're getting screwed. And unless people start getting this in their head, it's never going to change. And I have to take on the ideology because it drives me nuts, this libertarian bullshit. Here we have, I don't hate the libertarians, I love them. They're the ones I argue with the most because they're my mates. But they got their heads up their ass because they're not bothering to look at the history of how this came to be. And if you can come to me with a better system than an electricity system that's cheapest in the world, abundance of energy, and employs lots of bloody apprentices, I'd like to see you try. That's what we've got to go back to. And that means renationalisation and the government just putting its bloody boot on the gas cartel and cut the pussyfooting around.
Absolutely. Well, we know that what's been happening over the last 20, 30, 40 years has completely degraded Australia and put people in a much more difficult position than they should have been. So that's why we're arguing that there has to be a change of policy, a different economics, a different philosophy and a different approach. And here are a few examples that we've touched on tonight, which show you that some of those policies, could be done, but they will cut across, the traditional way of thinking. And that is actually the real point, I guess, I want to leave the conversation to tonight and close the conversation. There are some fundamental assumptions about the way economics works, politics works, and the way society works, and the role of politics and all of this, right? Those are some of the things that need to be questioned and changed, because there is an alternative path that provides a much more prosperous route for the future than what we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years. But It's not going to be status quo. It's got to be a different way of thinking about those things. And kudos to you, Robbie, and your party, because you've laid a lot of the foundations and a lot of the thinking for how to actually think about this differently.
Well, and on that note, now that I've calmed down, and I as you know, I can see myself in the screen here, Martin, and that I did see that vein pop in. So if it is Drew or my mate Drew,
Yeah.
you got what you wanted, but it's not performance art. Believe me, Martin, we just talk about subjects that it's red rag to a bull. But on a more positive note, we did have this excellent conference on Sunday. It was live streamed, so some people might have seen some of it, but the actual videos of the speeches are being uploaded as we speak. The great John Adams presented to our conference, and his speech has already been uploaded, which is about abolish and replace ASIC. So you can get on our channel and look at that now. It's really worth looking at. We gave Martin, we gave John 20 minutes, and he took 45. But
what do you expect?
No one went to sleep because it's John Adams. Now, there was the opening panel was about Australia needs an independent foreign policy, and that was a really profound panel with John Lander, Richard Yuan from a Chinese community leader, and Aisha Novakovic, who is a Muslim community leader, talking about various aspects of that. And then we had a panel on our policy. That's one of our headline policies. The other one is we need economic sovereignty and a national bank. And Elisa Barwick presented. Dr. Evan Jones presented. He was pre-recorded. Evan Jones is a great economist, but he's also the economics teacher of Albanese, and he's very disappointed in his former student. But Professor Andy Schmulo also presented that conference and also went over time, but in a brilliant way. I'm just foreshadowing these; they're not up yet, so just look out for them. When you see these, you've got to watch these speeches because they really electrified the audience. These speeches on banking, and Andy Schmulo was a powerhouse. We need that guy in the Senate. Let me tell you something. He would be if he gets to the Senate, I'd put out the sign. Justice is coming. He will take this fight up to the banks like nobody else. We had in-depth policies presented on how a postal bank will benefit small business by Jeff Fader, who's a former chairman of COSBOA. Michael Sanderson, one of the bank warriors, presented on the need for what's called law force or equality of arms between banks and financial victims. I mentioned John Shipton. Hakim Gassiap did a really insightful presentation. He's only been around us a few years, but on his view on the principal approach that our party takes. And what I did, which look for it when it comes up, but I did a presentation on how the Citizens Party will represent citizens in Parliament if we get elected. And the tack I took was just to highlight our successes from outside of Parliament, going back to 2017. And 2017, we picked that because that's when the bail-in fight started. And of course, the bail-in fight, Martin, is what introduced me to you and to John Adams, etc. And also to a friend in the Greens Party, the late Fraser Brindley. And one of the features of our work has been cooperation. We've really valued cooperation. So we lay it all out there. And from that time, we've introduced, we've achieved 11 Senate inquiries since 2017, introduced legislation 4 times, and stopped 2 bills, and are about to stop a 3rd bill through our work, either single-handedly or as part of a broader mobilisation where we've played an important role. And so that record shows people how the Citizens Party operates. And the question is, if this party can be that successful outside of Parliament, what could we do inside Parliament? And that's the message we want to get to the public for the election campaign. But I really encourage people to watch these speeches and help share them around, you'll see them we hope to have them all up by the end of the week. Just look at the quality of input that's gone into developing our policies with our focus on these vested interests. That's the key thing, right? Because to us, that's what you got to break. You can argue the details of different policies till the cows come home. But if we don't break the vested interest, then we're arguing
over something we don't have any power over. That's the point. We have to break those vested interests, control over politics, and then the people once again have the power. And then I'll go back to arguing with the Greens on specific, things, and arguing with the Liberals on specific things, and Labor and the, you can argue the details on those things then, because the better argument hopefully will win. But we don't have the power yet. And that's why we've got to break the vested interest. That's what we're concentrating on.
Yeah, Robbie, well, thank you. And a lot of people in the chat are saying, great. Alison said, another great session. Good night, everyone. Cheers, Alison. And Jason, thanks for the super chat. Robbie, if people want to find out more about the Citizens Party, where do they go?
citizensparty.org.au, and it's called the Citizens Party Australian Citizens Party on YouTube. And if you want to talk to us, call our toll-free number 1-800-636-432. And
I just want to highlight that you do a weekly show on YouTube as well, and also a weekly publication, which is worth its weight in gold. So much really good insight goes into it.
Thanks, Martin.
Robbie, thank you very much for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. I think we've covered a lot of ground, very important issues, and I look forward to keeping the conversation going in the weeks ahead. So things will continue to evolve. So I'll take it offline now, and I'm going to close the show. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.
There you go. Well, I hope you enjoyed that really powerful conversation from Robbie tonight. And thank you very much for all the conversation and everything that's went on in the chat there. I want to say wish you well for the next week or so. We've got snow here today, just started outside, so not sure what the weather's going to be, but it'll be very interesting to see how things go ahead. Next week, I'm not sure who my guest will be. I've invited Cameron to come on a week late. We'll see whether he does that. If he doesn't, I'll find probably somebody else, or I may even come on myself and we'll have a conversation. Always things to talk about. But anyway, thank you very much for sharing some time with them this evening. The dogs are here, looking at the snow through the window halfway through, and then they've come back to go back for a bit more of a snooze. So that'll be interesting. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the next Tuesday show, which will be live. And also, of course, I put up recorded shows each day of the week. Thank you very much for all the comments, super chats, and thank you for your time tonight. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. We'll see you next time. Take care.